Hi there, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Monday's stream. This is a stream focusing on the physical performance of esports athletes and they're comparing their kind of traits and attributes that athletes in the esports world face similarly to the aspects and traits of a physical athlete. I've got some great guests with me on today, but I'll introduce those to you in a moment. But before we do that, I just want to talk to you quickly about a couple of British Esports updates. So first of all, we announced last week that we are going to be holding a Rocket League Showdown tournament coming up at the end of May in the May half term. So that's going to be held on the 25th to the 29th of May. And then also I want to just shout about the support that we're giving to the National Video Game Museum, which starts, well, it's already been undergo for quite some time actually, since the lockdown has prevented them from earning any money through sponsorships, donations, and things like that. So we're supporting them in everywhere we can. Any donations or any revenue made from Twitch and any of our streams for the next month will be going straight to them 100%. So anyway, thanks very much, guys, for tuning in today. I hope you enjoy this stream, learning a little bit about what esports can learn from the sort of physical activity industry and the sports industry, and how we can translate those skills. So today with me, I have two very special guests, one of which I've worked with before in the past, and somebody who I've just met today, but they're both great people. So I'll introduce them as we speak. So I've got Alex Davies, who works for Barrage Esports, as you can see, and I've got Daniel Lavipore, who is a strength and conditioning coach. So welcome, guys. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you, Elliot?
I'm brilliant. Yeah, I'm enjoying this being inside on a nice bright day. How about you, Alex? All right?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you, mate. I'm trying to trudge through a lot of work for my sort of fourth year of university, so I'm stressed, but I'm all right. Yeah.
Cool. So let's to start off then, Dan. Why don't you just tell me a little bit about yourself, what you do, kind of what industry you're in, and what inspires you to do it.
Yeah, so I'm a strength and conditioning coach. For those who aren't too familiar with that job title and that term, it's a profession which is concerned with the physical preparation, typically of athletes. Although the principles of the profession could be translated to other industries where health and performance is a factor, and potentially one of those, well, certainly one of those could be esports as well. Right now, I work for the FA, supporting the England men's and women's football teams across all the different age groups. And I also work in the Netball Super League, supporting a team called London Pulse, who obviously represent London and the Southeast region. Prior to that, my background's in Olympic sports. I worked for the New Zealand Olympic team and Team GB across mainly endurance sports, but also in rehab. And, I have a real passion for sports science and anything that falls under the kind of performance category and spectrum, which is why I'm very excited to speak to yourself and Alex about esports and all things performance sports science as well.
So you don't really know much about esports. So you this is kind of your first foray into the industry and the esports world. But Alex, you've from the esports world, but you work in a performance aspect of it. So just tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my original background was in sports coaching. Spent 9, 10 years coaching tennis. That was sort of my original background from a very young age after not playing, after having an injury and not playing sort of thing, the
Yeah.
classic sort of stuff. I then moved into esports that sort of coincided with my degree. So my degree is sports management and I'm specializing in performance coaching. And I just started to notice the more I sort of got watching esports, playing video games, things like that, that there seemed to me to be sort of a lack of understanding of both sides of the spectrum, the physical side, the health side, the well-being side, and then sort of playing video games and being a part of esports. So what I do now is I'm a performance coach for Barrage, specifically their League of Legends team, who are now in the NLC, which is a really amazing, fun new league that's going ahead with that was some teams from the UKLC and some teams from sort of Nordic regions competing for an EU master spot. So that's sort of me in a nutshell right now.
Amazing, amazing. So I mean, just talking about how good and how important physical activity is for a person, just in day-to-day life. Obviously, we all know, being fit and healthy, leads to living longer, you know, increased, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Increased, um,
quality of life.
Well, it wasn't where I was going, but that'll do nicely. Yeah, increased quality of life. I think mood. Yeah, mood.
Yeah.
A better quality mood. That's like it releases endorphins, makes you feel good. You've got all these great things that are associated with it. Similarly, in the esports world, playing games, you're having fun, you're communicating, you're building relationships, and at the same time, you're experiencing many of the same things that you get through physical activity. So, like, how important would you say, Dan, particularly, that physical activity is to a person?
Yeah, we like you highlighted well. It's fundamental. The benefits of physical activity, like you said, for mood and your mental health. There's huge amounts of evidence supporting that position, and we know when people are experiencing less opportunities to be physically active, we can see quite serious mental health consequences come from that. And Alex, I know this is something you're interested in as well, and feel free to chime in. From a physical perspective, again, the evidence around physical activity is clear, and it's critical for everyone to engage in it, young people and old people. Particularly young people being physically active can also have significant consequences for you later in life, or rather a lack of physical activity early on in life can mean you're less active later on. And it's really important young people are setting up good habits early on by being active, like you said.
So, I mean, Alex, we were just talking briefly before the stream started about the latest announcement from the government. But with social distancing, how much of a problem has this caused for you, being in the pro scene and being a coach for Barrage?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're in this is actually something that most people don't see as a fortunate situation, because normally with esports, people want to be offline. They want to be in a physical place. They want to be working out of offices. They want to be working in gaming houses potentially, and that's not something that Barrage has the luxury of. Like most of the esports organizations out there. So we've been working online. We're currently going through trials, which means we're essentially looking for new individuals or previous individuals that have been a part of Barrage to make up the new team that we're putting forward into the NLC. So in terms of how it's been affecting Barrage, we've actually been sort of unscathed, really. We've been going on as normal, which is actually really, really, really lucky that we have the ability to do that. Yeah. But I think the sort of biggest thing is for esports athletes, more often than not, I would expect physical activity to not be the top of the priority. And that's through my sort of anecdotal evidence, my anecdotal experience of being a part of the industry, but also through, luckily, my dissertation is actually on esports performance and what is perceived to impact esports performance by esports athletes. And through the people that have been questioned, I say questioned like it's not quite like it's a questionnaire. So through those people, physical activity is one of the things that isn't as sort of highly touted as important to these guys. I think now, sort of from lockdown's perspective, is like an amazing time to start. I don't know if you agree with that, Daniel, but
well, I think
100%.
Dan's probably really suffering actually with the lockdown, having to work from home. Obviously a lot of the things you end up doing, Dan, are probably outdoors and meeting people, talking to people, showing how to do things, and that kind of cripples you in a way, I guess.
Well, certain types of exercise are obviously no longer possible, but we also have more time. We have our commuting time back, and unfortunately a lot of people don't have the opportunity to work in the same way. But maybe one positive of that is there is more time, and like Alex said, we're given this opportunity to train right now, and hopefully people will use it. In the sporting world, two types of athletes are going to emerge from this lockdown: those who trained and those who didn't. And from a performance perspective, those who don't train are going to suffer, but also from an injury perspective, I think a lot of athletes are going to be in a lot of trouble. We're probably going to have quite a short lead in to our first games and competitions when things are allowed to start again. And a failure to physically prepare in this time is going to mean athletes won't be as robust and resilient to injury and could get hurt in those first couple games and tournaments. But there is this opportunity to do something, and like Alex said, for those who haven't done something before, maybe this is a time to start.
Yeah, I think, like, obviously you've got your training regimes with your clubs and your students and anybody who's, under your care. What kind of advice do you, well, not advice really, but what kind of fitness strategies have you got with them, currently throughout the lockdown? How have they been training? Have you got like a home thing set up, or how have you done it?
Yeah, great question. So we're making use of online training. And previously, when coaches had suggested to put a video in the gym for an athlete who couldn't make normal training, I always said, no, this would be the worst idea ever. No one wants to train with a video on them. No one wants to talk to a screen,
Yeah,
do their exercise, but we're actually finding it's working really well.
that's
The
really good.
engagement of the players is high. The adherence to the program is high. And it's almost certainly going to be something we continue after the lockdown. And like I just mentioned, we're getting time back when players would have been commuting to training that we can use for training itself and recovery.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of positive things to it. In terms of strategies that we're using, we're obviously trying to work around the fact we don't have access to the same equipment that we would typically use. The main things we don't have access to is high load heavy weights that we do
Yeah,
high load work with. That work's really important for a lot of athletes in a lot of sports to teach them to handle those higher load and high strength moments in their sport. So we're having to get quite creative with the types of exercises we use to get the same adaptation. Now, there's some things you can't replace, but we're finding by being creative, we're actually able to still do a lot of the work that we wanted to do anyway. And we're definitely learning that by going back to basics, we're embedding a lot of the fundamentals, but there is also a lot that you can do at home with nothing. And this applies not just to pro or Olympic athletes, but to anyone who wants to keep fit, and certainly those in the esports world as well.
so I mean, you're talking about, just using your own weight, I suppose, and resistance training, gravity as a natural force, and training that way. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, 100%. Look, if you weigh 70 kg, well, there's 70 kgs of weights there that you can play with. And then by manipulating the exercise, you can either increase or decrease the load. So let's say you wanted to do a lower body exercise today. Well, if you stand on two legs, it's slightly easier than standing on one leg. So you can increase the load by doing single leg exercises over double leg exercises if that was something that was important to you.
Gotcha.
Doing push-ups, if that's too easy, well, you can do handstand push-ups. Or if push-ups are too hard, you can put your hands a little higher than the floor, and now you weigh a little less and it's a little easier. So yeah, body weight is a great weight to play with, and you can use it in a ton of different ways.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, probably not many people think about that. So Alex, how are you coping, from home? What's your exercise strategy?
Yeah, so for me, mostly I was personally I was bulking for a really long time. So I was in a caloric surplus. I was eating more calories than my body sort of would burn, including exercise. And I found this has been a pretty good time to switch to a little bit of a cut. And I've been focusing more on HIIT exercises, cardio exercises. I used to go to the gym 3-4 times a week. I would lift heavy, and unfortunately I can't do that anymore. So it's been actually really fun for me to learn more about sort of body weight training and resistance training in that format, because it's not something that many people focus on. But when it comes to the players that I've worked with in the past and sort of informing these guys about exercise, it is really different, because people like myself and like especially like Dan, who has been exercising for a while. Unfortunately, many esports athletes aren't in that scenario. So in terms of informing them as to what to do, it's been sort of very, very, very different, but intriguing and interesting nonetheless.
All right, good
Well,
stuff.
body weight, sorry to interrupt, Elliot.
Sorry?
Body weight training is where training starts. And for anyone looking to start training, you should really learn to master the basic movements at body weight before you move on to anything else. And if Alex and you were saying that a lot of esport athletes aren't necessarily that experienced with exercise, well, the fact that you only have body weight right now should not be a limiter for you getting started, because that's the beginning of everything else.
Yeah, there's this huge misconception, I think, especially when you haven't done any exercise before, or you don't have a partner who's going, right, come on, we'll go to the gym together or whatever. But you think like, oh, I can't do it because I've got to go and get a gym membership, or I've got to go and use these machines. And half the time you don't even know how to use the machine. Arrive at the gym fresh-faced, looking a bit nervous, and then you just let loose. You might have one session with a PT, But yeah, no, I totally agree. And if you haven't done it, you don't need to do it. There's nothing you can do in a gym that you can't do from home, really. Like, apart from Dan said, the very high load weights. But yeah, it's really about, I think before you even start worrying about that, you kind of need to focus on your discipline and your commitment to improving, whether that is, physically or mentally, or even just in your chosen field, esports or sports. Either way, I think that's the priority you need to focus on first before you end up going to the gym. So there's been some evidence recently, it's come out from government studies and things, that people on low income and people in urban areas are finding it harder to be active during this outbreak. So with that in mind, what's your advice for these people? Let's go with Dan first.
Yeah, it's an important statistic. In performance, we see similar trends as well. And the statistic that really stood out to me at the last 2 Olympic Games, I think it was 30% of Team GB were made up of athletes from independent schools, when pupils from independent schools only make up 6% of the country. So whether it's indices of health or indices of performance, it's our poorest communities who have the worst outcomes. And the answer to this question is kind of going beyond my area of expertise, but it's certainly important that you flagged it up and that people are talking about it. In terms of what's limiting people taking up exercise right now, well, we're all in our homes, and like we said before, you don't need much equipment. So if cost was a limiter for you taking up exercise before, in terms of joining a sports team or purchasing equipment, well, like we just mentioned, there's so much you can do at home, and if you have the space to do it, well, hopefully you're able to to take that up and start with it, because cost isn't that limiter anymore.
Okay, that's a good answer. Thank you. So I was thinking, let's get into the real nitty gritty stuff here, and how are we improving esports athletes using traditional training techniques? I think one of the most important things that was raised, when I was thinking about this stream and the subjects we were going to talk about, and somebody mentioned focus, and I think that's a really important attribute that gets overlooked quite a lot of time. Being able to stay in that state of mind where you're concentrating, you're not losing track of stuff. You're able to follow everything that you need to follow quickly, make decisions based on the information you're receiving. And I was really thinking, what kind of techniques are there from a physical side that would help promote this level of focus? Let's go to Alex.
Yeah, so essentially this is pretty much my thesis, my dissertation. I have a 70-page document sitting just over there that details this pretty in depth. But things like focus is what would be described as a cognitive ability and a cognitive function. Essentially what that sort of describes is your cognitive functions and what your brain can do. And improving cognitive function is, in my opinion, imperative to improving esports performance. So the three sort of really basic facets of that that literature suggests is really important at the moment is exercise, is nutrition, and is sleep. So those are the sort of three pillars to most of the work that I do, is ensuring that these three things are foundationally very, very strong. And obviously that's different to everyone. It depends on what your goal is. If you want to be really strong, the way you go about that is completely different to if you just want to cognitively, sort of, as I say, as your brain, be really, really strong, really sharp, have good focus, have good attention, things like that. So it's a really in-depth question, and I don't want to go into too much detail because we only have an hour and not 5. So,
right, okay.
But yeah, those are sort of 3 things. So if I was to quickly glance over all of them, for exercise, for me, it's about what the literature suggests the best for cognitive function is things like green exercise, which is essentially just getting outdoors, being around things that are green, trees, grass, bushes, get to your park, get things like that, recreational grounds. Whether it's a 20-minute walk, whether it's a little bit of cardio, maybe it's some HIIT exercise. These are the sort of things that are amazing for cognitive function. For focus specifically is really strong. For diet, nutrition, There are things like caffeine. I don't really like getting into the weeds of caffeine quite too much, because caffeine dosage is a real big problem, as maybe Dan's found in his work as well, making sure that it's, 100 milligrams of caffeine might have no effect on me, but it might have a huge effect on someone else. So for nutrition, it was mostly about plant metabolites. So things in fruit and veg are really, really good for focus and attention. And then finally, sleep. It's about getting the right amount of sleep for you. The general ballpark is sort of 8 hours from what most literature suggests. Again, this is massively dependent on the person. For focus, those are the most important things in my opinion. But I'm sure Dan can help with getting a bit more to do with the exercise side of it.
Yeah, what you mentioned about green exercise is something I've come across before, and potentially a really important point. And I can imagine if you're an esports athlete and you're spending a lot of time on the screen, well, going to a gym and staring at a treadmill or a screen there is not what you want to be doing anymore, and you need some respite from that time you've been spending there. When it comes to cognitive function, and which is really decision making in sport, we know that being fit and aerobically fit for your sport is super important. When we look at the evidence around decision making at the ends of games when players are tired, we know that there's more errors that occur. Those who are able to be fitter and like I say, aerobically fitter, are able to make the same high level of decisions throughout a game from start to finish.
So you'd say then that aerobic fitness is kind of the key to maintaining, long periods of focus. Oh, not excluding Alex's points as well, but I mean, just from your perspective.
Yeah, in our world, your aerobic fitness can be seen as your foundation. And like I said, we've seen decision making become impaired for those who are not aerobically fit enough to handle the duration of the games that they're involved in.
Wow.
It's really interesting. Sorry to interrupt there, but one of the papers that I've been looking at recently was talking about the effect of acute exercise. So for those who don't know that really in depth, you have like maximal, moderate, and acute. I think you can correct me if I'm wrong at any point, Dan, feel free. But the acute exercise is things that don't really get your heart rate pumping too hard. And this paper specifically was saying that that's the stage in which the most consistent, correct decisions are made. So I guess that sort of links nicely with what you were saying there, is if it was maximal, i.e. you're really tired, you're really gassed at the end of a 90-minute football game, for example, your decision-making is impaired.
Yeah, so at lower intensities of exercise is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Easier to make decisions.
Mm.
And therefore, if you're fitter and your sport sits more within your capacity, well, it's relatively easier for you. If you're less fit, well, guess what? The game's going to always feel harder for you, and your decision making, like Alex said, will be impaired. But we also see, with a lack of fitness, a drop in motor control at the end of games. So when we look at injuries related to how athletes are able to maintain their technique at ends of games, those who are less able to maintain their technique because they're lacking in fitness suffer more serious injuries, or any injury at all, towards the ends of games. Now, how that would relate to the dexterity required in your thumbs for esports, I don't know, but we definitely see that decrement, that loss of motor control towards the end of the games where players are getting more tired.
That's really interesting. I'd never even considered that before. That's amazing. So just quickly, I've got a question in chat that I missed earlier on, and it was aimed at you, Dan, and it actually leads into my next segment quite nicely, so I'll ask it now. Do performance/conditioning coaches also cover the mental health of players? Now I know you do, but it kind of leads into my next question, which was kind of how important is your mental health, compared to your physical health, and in terms of translating that into a video game scenario.
Yeah, it's a great question. So if the question's about mental health, well, every member of the support team has a responsibility for the mental health of those they're supporting and they're working with. If the question is more around, does the strength and conditioning coach have a responsibility for overseeing the sports psychology of the athlete? The answer is yes, but it depends on the situation and the team you're involved with. So when you're in a heavily resourced team, there's more than likely going to be a dedicated sports psychologist.
Yeah, of course.
and they would oversee any intervention or any strategies around enhancing any factors related to sports psychology. In sports where things are less well funded, well, the responsibility to oversee sports psych sits across the people who are involved, and that might be between you as the strength and conditioning coach, the head coach, and the physio, which might be the bare bones of a team. Obviously, the whole area is done a lot better when a sports psych is leading it, but one of the cool things about my profession, it'll be the same with Alex too, is we sit across a lot of different professions. We're a little bit of biomechanics, we're a little bit of rehabilitation, we're a bit of physiology, we're a bit of coaching, and of course strength and conditioning as well. But sports psychology is super important, mental health even more important, and as anyone in a position of responsibility for supporting an athlete, you must have an understanding of these areas to some degree.
Amazing, good answer, thank you. So Alex, in the terms of the professional scene then, because as Dan was obviously saying about how heavily resourced the team is, what kind of structure do you have in your organization? Do you have specific coaches who are looking out for mental health, and what's it look like on your side of things?
Yeah, I would say for Barrage, that sort of stuff sits with everyone, like Dan was saying.
Right.
We have an owner who's amazing. We have a manager who's also amazing. We have a head coach. And last split, we had an assistant coach as well. And that sort of responsibility, I think, falls to everyone. I think if you're talking about improving mental health, like that is something that I don't think any of us would necessarily say we specialize in.
Yeah.
But I think looking out for mental health is a different sort of kettle of fish, and I think that's something that everyone sort of takes part in. I think certain things like exercise and like sleep are really important for mental health. So in terms of specifically looking out for that, we have one-on-one sessions with players. There is only 5 players in the starting team. We don't tend to have substitutions that quite work like traditional sports. They're not rolling in that sense. It tends to be the 5 players that play consistently through the year or through the split. So yeah, it's a small team that works in a very dedicated way for these 5 individuals as well. So I think it's like a consistent, we're always checking up on these sort of things.
Great stuff. Right. So I mean, with this kind of team structure that you've just demonstrated, is that something that you have, Dan, or are you more or less on your own?
Yeah, again, it depends on the situation. So obviously in my role with the FA, they're more resourced than any other team you might find in the UK. So I have the luxury of working alongside each discipline within the full sports science team, so sports medicine, sports psychology, biomechanics, physiology, etc. My role with netball, well, the sport's not a position to be as resourced as football is it right now. And really our team is a head coach, assistant coach, myself, and a physiotherapist. And anyone else we would bring in on a needs based.
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, it changes. It changes. And in netball, I have to wear a few more hats than I do within football. But of course, you have to have that ability to understand what each of the other disciplines is doing and know how to move into that space to work with them, even if you are really lucky to have them working alongside you.
Cool. So I don't want to go too much into this next one, but how much would you say is enough physical activity? How many training sessions do you advise per week? I know it differs per person, but let's say you were talking about the average person who doesn't really do any activity outside of, walking to the shops once or twice a week. And then the rest of the time they're on lockdown. So how much activity would you recommend to the general person?
Yeah, so for adults, the national guidance is to do for adults 30 minutes a day, 5 times a week. But it depends, like you said in your question, what are you doing? You like doing? Some exercise, if it's intense, you need to do less. If it's lower intensity, you probably need to do a bit more. Some activities just take longer to do. If you're trying to pick up a new skill, I don't know if you're into martial arts or boxing, well, maybe you like spending a bit more time at the gym to pick up all the skills that are important for you to move on with your new pastime. So it depends. I think most people want to do something every day if they like training, and often if they don't do something every day, they feel that something's missing. But at the same time, there isn't a requirement to do something every day to be fit, because It really depends on what you're doing and how much rest you need as well from the work that you've done. If you've done something particularly intense for a couple of days, well, it's a great idea to take a couple of days off and let the body regenerate before you get back into it later on in the week.
Yeah, I think people often forget how important, the rest period is to recovery and regeneration, and that in some ways is almost as key as the actual training session itself, because otherwise your body isn't going to be able to improve. It's not going to be able to make those adjustments to the stresses you've just put it through. So people will often forget about that. Alex, I think this is a really good question for you, because you've been in the sports world for a long time and you're now in the esports world. So I think you've probably got to have the best grasp on this next question. It's about human connection and how important meeting people in day-to-day life, having a chat in face-to-face. And obviously we're all doing this scenario now where we're all on Skype or Zoom or Facebook Live or groups or Hangouts, whatever it is, and yes, lots of people have adjusted to it, but lots of people have also felt the need to socialize, and the fact that they've been missing out on it for quite some time now. So how important do you think this is? Well, not how important, how sustainable do you think that this is in terms of an acceptable substitute to face-to-face interaction?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. One thing that we do at Barrage when we're looking at new players is we do personality tests. And one of the basic ones is the Myers-Briggs Test, which looks at loads of different things. But essentially what I'm trying to get at here is it looks at whether you're introverted or you're extroverted. Now, the majority of esports athletes that we've done probably somewhere around 100, 150 different tests over the last 3 splits. The majority of esports athletes are introverted, but that doesn't mean that you can just sit at your computer all day and not have human interaction.
Yeah.
For example, in Barrage, I try my hardest to make sure that players, when they're in League of Legends, you have solo queue where you play by yourself, and then you can duo with people, which means you play with one other individual. And that's their basic form of training. I try and stress the importance of duo queue over and over and over and over and over again, because this is, an esports athlete's way of really connecting with someone and spending time talking to them. They're in the game, they're talking to each other while they're playing the game, they're getting to know each other a little better. These sort of things are just imperative. When it comes to is this a substitute for talking and getting to know people face to face? I don't think it's a substitute, but I don't think it should be seen as a substitute as well. I think it's a different thing. And much like everything, there needs to be a balance, in my opinion. So
yeah, of course.
If you're spending 10 hours a day, which 16 hours a day in some circumstances for League of Legends players at your computer, it's best to do that alongside someone,
I can see the shock on Dan's face when you said 16 hours there.
Yeah. Any kind of contact is important. And in time of enforced isolation, one of the things we're seeing with our athletes, and particularly with the netballers I'm working with right now, is that they would be on their own without the contact we are having through Zoom. And it doesn't replace human contact. It is different, but it's something. And the feedback from the players, but also us as a group of staff, has been that it's brilliant and it's getting us through what's a really difficult time. And like Alex explained so well, if you are spending 16 hours playing the game, you may as well play it with someone else in terms of getting the opportunity to connect with someone.
Definitely. I've got a question from Spyron in the chat. He says, are there any easy exercises / routines that you can do sat at your chair in between games? Now, before I let you guys answer that, Spyron, you may have noticed that we don't have any use for the channel points at the moment other than highlighting messages. However, in the next week or so, I will be adding some exercises to be redeemed with your channel points, so that at the end of each session you can therefore make me do a load of squats or a load of sit-ups or a load of press-ups, however it is you see fit to spend them. It's not actually my idea, I can't take credit for it. It's from Gregan, who's a good friend of ours and a game advisor for Rocket League, but I thought it was a fantastic idea and something that everybody should be doing. So but yes, anyway, please answer the question, guys. Are there any easy exercises / routines that you can do sat at your chair in between games? Alex first, I guess.
Yeah. So in terms of exercises, I wouldn't answer that one specifically in terms of physical exercise, physical activity. I'm not entirely sure about that. But what I do with my players and with many, many individuals in esports is stretching. Now, there's such a problem for repetitive strain injury when it's micro movements and little movements of the mouse, little movements of your thumbs, potentially the keyboard. You're sort of, if your posture's not good, for example, and you're hunched over horribly, stretching is a really amazing way to make sure that you're sort of preventing injury. And that's what we do at Barrage. I'll make sure everyone's educated on how we do these stretches properly, make sure it's not done in an awkward way. But certain stretches for the wrist, certain stretches. So the things that I focus on with the players is hamstrings, is wrists. It's a little bit of strengthening for the core and things like that, but it's mostly back care and wrist care, because that's where the most injuries can occur. So you can literally just Google stretches in your chair and there will be loads and loads and loads of stretches. So I don't want to go into too much detail on that. But for me, the key areas would be hamstrings, because that can help with your lower back care, and wrists in between games.
Yeah, I'd have to say that those are probably the most recurring injuries that I hear people talk about, particularly in the esports world. Dan, anything to weigh in there?
Yeah, I think, firstly, if you want to exercise, you're probably going to have to get out the chair. And it doesn't mean, though, that you need a lot of equipment like we mentioned before. Maybe it's getting out the chair and dropping to the floor and doing however many push-ups you can handle, or however many squats. When you're deciding what exercises to do, you want to be thinking about training the whole body, the upper body and the lower body. And you can even split those two regions up to another level of detail at the upper body. You can be thinking about pushing and pulling. Now, pushing movements are really easy to do at home because you can do push-up variations, or if you have some dumbbells, you can push them. Pulling movements are a little bit more difficult because you do need some equipment to do them. You need to hold on to something so you can pull. So you would need some weights or some bands or a pull-up bar, or maybe you have a TRX. Although you can also be quite novel and you can drop under your table, grip onto the sides of the table and do some inverted rows where your heel would be on the floor and you're pulling your chest up to the corner of the table, if you can picture yourself doing that. For the lower body, we often split exercises into double leg and single leg exercises. So double leg exercises are squats, single leg exercises are things like step ups and lunges. So you can start to pick up quite a well-rounded routine by thinking of the body in terms of those different areas: a push, a pull, a squatting movement, a single leg movement, and then some core work as well. I think the stretching stuff is super important. And one of the things we're finding with athletes right now is they're going straight to train from being sat at their desk doing uni work, or maybe gaming as well, but they're certainly sat down, and they're not going through a process of getting their posture corrected prior to training. And it's something we're having to mitigate with extra warm-up. So potentially some of the mobility and flexibility stuff Alex is talking about has another role, not just to address some of the issues he highlighted, but preparing you for that quick little bit of a workout you can do in between games, like the question highlighted.
Does that affect it then? If you've been sat in your chair for a long time and you've got hunched over and then you get up to go and do something, are you not sort of corrected as soon as you stand upright?
Yeah, great question. So the seated posture brings with it all sorts of problems. So your shoulders go into what we call a kyphotic position, which is rounded. The lumbar is rounded as well. It's called a flexed lumbar spine. You have shortened hip flexors, shortened hamstrings, and shortened calves. And all those traits, all those factors I just mentioned, you want the exact opposite for the majority of movements that you do when you're training. You want to be neutral extended through the shoulders. You want to be neutral through the lumbar spine, and you want to have long hip flexors, hamstrings, and calves. If you go to exercise in the position I just described, from being sat too long, it does leave you a little compromised. You can't quite execute. Sorry, I can't speak. You can't quite execute the exercises as well as you would want, and there's obviously a risk of injury. But it also just feels a little more uncomfortable because you feel stiffer and you're not quite moving as free as you want.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Spyro in the chat says, thank you very much for answering. And he says, my wife says my posture is terrible. And you know what? I'm like listening to you, and all I can think about is, oh my God, look at myself. I'm super hunched, and my back hurts. No, but that is really important. Actually, is posture, I think, overlooked again. Is that something you encounter, Alex? Posture?
Yeah, it's kind of frightening. The problem is most of the time I don't see the guys that I work with because it is online. We don't. It's not like video calls like Zoom and things like that. It tends to just be TeamSpeak and programs like that. So
So you're not even video calling, you're just kind of
yeah,
audio, right?
yeah. Most of the time, I would say like a good 95% of the time. The only difference was when we have things like media days where we have all of the esports athletes come to one place to create content, do things like that. And it's, I kind of feel like a dad harping on or like a teacher. It's like, correct your posture. These sort of things are just like, it's very normal, as Dan said, it's this sort of like natural hunched over sort of stuff that you'll notice that you just sort of end up there, really is the only way I can describe it. Through no fault of your own, more often than not, you sort of end up closer to the screen and hunched over, and your legs are tucked well underneath you. Things like this are just for some reason, and I can't tell you why, maybe Dan can, but it just sort of happens, really. And just correcting that is really, really important, I think. So
obviously, I'm just we've got about 15 or so minutes left of the interview here. I just want to quickly go through another couple of points. So obviously my job is the schools and colleges liaison officer for the Esports Association, but what that entails is kind of promoting and educating the benefits of esports to students across the country, and my primary method of doing that is explaining esports requires focus, dexterity, teamwork, leadership, fast reaction times, decision making, all of these kind of good skills that are transferable to teachers, to parents, to facilitators and carers and things. But I guess this question is really for, well, both of you, I suppose, but like how transferable, let's say 10 is the most transferable, are these skills between esports and sports? I don't know who wants to go first.
Yeah. Alex?
Yeah, sure. So there is a definite difference with esports athletes that I've noticed. Again, anecdotal evidence, don't take this as gospel, don't take this as fact. Those who have been in a traditional sports setting at some point are better at dealing with conflict when it comes to esport, and vice versa. These sort of team environments, team scenarios are so valuable for esports athletes and traditional sports athletes. So I think a lot of the things are scarily transferable. There's a reason why it's called esports, because in my opinion, it shouldn't be classified as a sport, and it should be something completely different. I don't know how many people that might upset, but the lack of physicality is a big no-no for me to therefore call it a sport. But I think in terms of transferable skills, for example, if you're a football player, trying to find the correct pass to play at that time is a decision-making skill. In the same way that if you're a League of Legends athlete, do I need to roam here? Should I shove my lane? Should I look to go for an objective? These sort of questions are very similar. And in terms of cognitively, I think scarily transferable, like way more than you would imagine as a general sort of rule.
Well, I guess, Dan, you're the general, public who doesn't know much about it. So, I guess your opinion might be slightly different.
Yeah, I'm listening and my brain's spinning. I'm wondering as you're talking, what benefit there might be for different athletes to play their sport on the computer. Can you pick up a skill?
Yeah.
By playing the game, in a virtual way that leads you to see different opportunities on the court or the pitch when you play it for real. Well, it's a great question. I don't know if that study's been done, but it's certainly a great question.
I can give you some real life examples. There's obviously you've probably heard of FIFA, football game, and Pro Evolution Soccer and things like that. Now in the game, obviously you've got that bird's eye camera. You're looking at the pitch from top down, which gives you a huge amount of thought processes that you don't have when you're a player on the field. So like when you're down there, you can only see linearly, left, right, and in front of you. But when you're playing the game, you've got up here, you've got all the passes, you can see all the plays backwards, forwards, so you've got that extra information that you wouldn't necessarily have. On top of that, you've got individual players who can do, skills and tricks and things. So there's this kid who played FIFA with his mates at home, turned up at training a week later and said to his coach, "Look, I did this trick. I did this weird flick on FIFA. Show me how to do it." So he's done something in game and then gone to his football coach and said, "Can you show me how to do it?" So there are obviously applicable uses. I definitely agree. And, we've had a lot of traction, particularly during the lockdown, from various sporting organisations, clubs, just local communities, to say, look, how can I keep my team engaged with each other? We want to still play as a team, but we can't go outside. How can we get involved? You've got, FIFA and your tennis games, your table tennis game. It's a bit unusual for netball, Dan. Unfortunately, there isn't a netball game I can think of that pops to head straight away. But, I definitely think that actually during the scope of this lockdown, lots of those games will have been or will be beginning to be created right now. So
it's a great story you gave about the kid who did a trick on FIFA and then went to his football coach and said, "Can you teach me this?"
Yeah.
Now I imagine that a lot of people are getting into the game FIFA because they like football in the real world, if I can call it that.
Yeah.
But if your entry into football is playing FIFA, well, I hope a lot of people were able to make the move to play in the game outside. And like Alex said, that esports and sports are different. You need to have physical activity in your week. And if you can be inspired by the game you play to take up a sport, that's super cool. And maybe for those who are playing combat games that involve martial arts, well, why not go take up a martial art if that's where your head is at and what you're into. And I think you'll probably fall in love with fighting and martial arts in the real world, just like you have in the game.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, probably quite true as well. Alex?
I think just quickly, if you don't mind me adding one thing on as well, I think one of the amazing things that esports has that in some sports, I don't want to generalize, I hate generalization, so I don't want to generalize here. It's just the sheer amount of stimuli. I'm going to keep going back to League of Legends because that's the game that I work with, so apologies for that. But the sheer amount of stimuli that needs to be taken in, we don't have enough digits between the three of us to count how many will be going on at 1 second. So when it comes to tennis, for example, my sport, the stimuli are significantly less. If we're just talking about forgetting the crowd and things like that, we're talking about, let's say I'm playing Dan, the stimuli are significantly less in that scenario than there are in League of Legends. And I think what that does is it has this amazing ability to disregard useless stimuli and really make sure that you're taking in the important stimuli. And I think that's one of the massive benefits of picking up video games and esports is your ability to disseminate stimuli in that way.
So that's a really amazing answer, and again, something that I'm learning so much from this, guys. It's just another thing I just don't think about. Obviously, it is important to be able to translate the really important information from a hell of a lot of useless information that is often associated. Yeah, definitely, really good point. Thank you. So, what about the element of competition in traditional sports and esports? I like to think that both can learn from each other. Particularly when I watch live esports events, and then when I go to live sporting events. Let's take football, for example. Rugby actually does a bit of a better job, but let's take football, for example. I'm in the crowd and I'm watching the game. The players look tiny. I've got a really bad seat. The bloke behind me's, chanting away and I can't hear anything. And if somebody scores, I'm not sure which player scored because I don't see the number, or there's no angle from where I'm sitting, and I have to watch the replay on the screen, and that's great. But that's 20 seconds later. Esports events are a bit different. Everything's in much larger detail. The replays are instant. You've got the casters kind of talking to you what's going on, play by play. So what kinds of things in the competitive spectator side can the industries learn from each other?
Hey, look, my sport, which is athletics, and I won't offend any athletics fans by saying this, it's often incredibly boring. It's incredibly boring for people who love it.
Yeah.
You go to a meet and there's big spaces between events where you're just waiting for something to happen. The events are often over quite quickly, and even the longer events, they don't draw you in the way they should, because of how great and engaging and incredible the people are, and certainly within that space, and it will be true for a lot of sports, they could make a much bigger and better event out of it. Now, where I work with London Pulse, we're at the Copper Box, which is an Olympic venue in East London, and I've seen the stadium be taken over by esports events. And I also won't offend the netball community or our team by saying they run an incredible event better than us, and the stadium's full. There seems to be a ton of energy and entertainment going on all the time, and all sports need to find more engaging ways of showing off what they have, and from what I've seen in esports, they do a great job of it. I'm sure there's a lot that can be learned.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one. I think esports has this sort of natural and consistent stuff happening. I know that sounds really bizarre, but naturally in the games that we play, they're very action-packed, regardless of the game, whether it's Rocket League, whether it's League of Legends, whether it's Dota, anything like this, they're very, very action-packed. You look at sports, I mean, I don't want to rag on the American football, but that's known as being a bit of a slower spectator sport with lots of breaks and lots of not things happening. And I think esports does have the leg up on that side. As this is not me as Mr. Esports, you know, my life is also like traditional sports. It's not just an esports sort of spectator from my point of view. The only thing is, I think esports has this amazing ability to be ahead of the game when it comes to social media as well.
Yeah.
We've only seen it a lot more recently, where traditional sports teams and organizations have taken to social media, whereas esports, like, it seems like there's a bit more of a finger on the pulse. I'm not entirely sure, but maybe that's some things that traditional sports could look to pick up from like a sector's point of view, is seeing how esports use social media.
And am I right that through social media, the esports players, they're super well known to everyone involved?
Yes, it's a really interesting thing, actually. Whereas in traditional sports, you'd follow a team. You know, I'm an Arsenal fan. You follow the team rather than the individual players. Whereas in esports, it's complete opposite. Well, maybe, you know, in some, like League of Legends, I'd say more primarily you'd follow the team. But in other games, you're very much focused on the individual player. You know, and if your player leaves that team and goes to, say, Man City, you then start following Man City, and that's acceptable. Whereas, you know, that would be travesty of football. It's a really different scenario, but it's because they developed their social media following. Their fans are very loyal to the player rather than the team. The team's just kind of the vehicle that the player uses. So yeah, it's very different. But
I think in football, you know, where there is so much exposure and everyone knows the players so well, the fans aren't just following the game; they're following people they know, and they really know their whole life story and everything that's gone into that, you know, that play that they're watching in the moment. Now, a lot of other sports just don't get that exposure.
No.
And, you know, like you mentioned, social media maybe doesn't come as naturally and doesn't fit as closely with, you know, real sports as it does fit so naturally with esports. And a lot of players are realizing that if they can build their social media profile, they bring in fans to the game who are not just following the results of the game, but following their own performance in it, and it's a really powerful way to boost engagement.
So I've just noticed we've only got a few minutes left here, so I just want to ask two questions left, really. Studies have shown esports professionals undergoing the same physiological stresses as top athletes. How is this possible? I think Alex first, because I guess you've probably seen that study, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think one thing that is the same between esports and traditional sports is competition, right? I think esports athletes will feel the exact same anxiety, the exact same nervousness. And these are physiological things as well. You know, you might get shaky, you might get short of breath. These are physiological responses, whilst they might be, you know, emotional or mental reactions or responses in that sense. Competition is the same throughout. And just because, just because you can't see the 100,000 people in X, Y, or Z stadium doesn't mean they're not there for esports. And whilst they might be sitting at their computer at home, or they might even be sitting in a stadium, you know, look at League of Legends finals, for example, World Championship finals. The spectators are there. And that's one of the big things that we try and make sure that esports athletes have the ability to deal with.
How many people were watching the finals, do you think?
For League of Legends?
Yeah.
Last year?
Yeah.
I wish I had the memory for it, but it is literally on a piece of paper over there. But I know it was concurrently more than the Super Bowl had, if I'm correct.
Wow. Yeah,
Wow.
that's insane.
Yeah. So yeah, giving them the ability to deal with these sort of physiological responses like shakiness, like how do I deal with, I'm short of breath, what is that going to do to me, and make sure that cycle doesn't set in of shortness of breath, anxiety, and things like this. That's the same.
So Dan,
so that's where I would go with it. Yeah.
So Dan, what would your advice be for kind of dealing with these?
But just to go back to the question, not all normal sports have the same physiological stresses to them. Some sports have more high-speed running. Some sports are shorter in duration. Some are longer. Some require more teamwork. Some are individual sports. Some sports have higher requirements to produce or absorb force. Some sports involve, jumping, and others involve throwing. And you can rank sports, not for good or bad, but you can rank sports based on the different physiological stresses that they have within them. AFL, which has the most high-speed running or most distance covered of any team sport, has more running than golf, which has none, right? And there'll be things that esports have that they might rank higher for than normal sports, maybe more decision-making, having to take in more stimulus, like you mentioned before, and process that in an ordered way. So, to answer the question, no, esports don't have the same physiological stresses as normal sports, but also all normal sports have different physiological stresses to each other.
Interesting. Thank you, Spyron, for pointing out in the chat there 2.9 million peak concurrent viewers for the League of Legends final. That's quite a significant amount of people. So I think, although Temporally's now just chimed in with 4 million current, I'm not sure the exact statistic, I'll have to look that up later. But anyway, moving on quickly. Yes, Dan, I want to just ask you, because I think this is going to be quite a transferable skill for the esports industry. As somebody who's made many training programs in the past and has come up, obviously you're looking at individuals and groups. What is the kind of process that you go through when customizing these training regimes or coming up with these programs?
Yeah, great question. It always starts with the performance question in mind. What are you trying to influence and achieve with the training program? And depending on that person's objectives, they will get a very different program or session. There's no one session which is the greatest workout out there. And for anyone looking to train or who already trains, if someone waves the magic training session at you, it's probably doesn't exist, and there's probably a fast one being pulled over you. It's about figuring out what's right for you and where you need to go. The other key question is what can that person do? What's their competency at different tasks? And are they able to do all the different elements of the training program? So there's no point giving a super advanced workout or training program to someone who's a novice. The program must sync with their ability to be able to do it safely and do it well. And like I said, it needs to backtrack from the end point of that training program. So we have a phrase when we're building a program that you start with the end in mind and you regress backwards to enable the athlete to tick off lots of different boxes on the way to that endpoint goal.
How often?
Any sports athlete really needs to be thinking, what am I trying to do? Trying to influence within my game, but also where do I want to take my physical training outside of esports and work back from there to figure out what they can do.
How often would you revisit these goals? Would you check progress every week, every other week? Because obviously gains in sport are a lot slower, aren't they, than they can be in the esports world? People can develop a lot faster in esports.
Yeah, you might give someone a new program every 3 or 6 weeks, but actually you're assessing them every rep.
Right.
And you're making decisions as you go. You might have a great plan, but when you give it to the athlete, it just doesn't quite match their ability to do it, and you need to regress it in the moment. Maybe they turn up on a day and because they've been sat down for too long, they've been doing that 16-hour gaming session, their posture isn't right. Well, maybe that workout isn't the right one for them to do in that moment, and you need to do some postural alignment or postural offloading and try the workout again, or give them something completely completely different. Coaching is a very fluid space, and you definitely have to be able to be nimble to make changes on the fly, as well as have these regular touch points, say every 3 or 6 weeks, to give a new update to their program.
Thank you. All right, so I think we're more or less coming to the end. I've got one more question I just want to ask you both, and if you could just give me like your bullet point answers, that would be great. Let's say top 3 tips for somebody who doesn't exercise as much as they probably should. Alex first.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I'll answer it from an esports athlete's point of view, and probably one that has been focusing on their craft, their video game.
Yeah.
I would say the first thing is start somewhere that you think you can consistently carry on with. For me, I would rather someone exercise once a week, every week for 12 weeks, than 5 times a week for 1 week and never went back again.
Like it, yeah.
So I would say consistency. I would say green exercise. And a third tip for an esports athlete with exercise is probably just match your action to a goal. So if you're just doing it cognitively, it's very, very different to wanting to lose weight or exercising for muscle mass. These are all different things, and look to match your action with a goal.
Nice.
Those would be the 3. That's
good. Dan?
Yeah, quite similar. I think setting up a routine that you can follow and is doable. Such a great point. Don't say you're going to do 5 days a week if that's not realistic to start with. But put a plan together that you can follow and stick to it. I've always found that if I said I was going to be at training at 6, well, I'm going to build my day around being at training at 6, and everything has to move around that. So once you've set your plan, stick to it. Like Alex said, work backwards from a goal, have an objective in mind, and try and make sure, maybe by getting some help, that the elements of your program match where you want to take your own training, rather than just doing some random stuff. The evidence out there is if you do just stuff, you're more likely to not adhere to it and keep going with it in the long run. So make sure it's purposeful to what you're trying to achieve. And then the last thing we touched on earlier, and also Alex said it as well, have a blend between some aerobic training and some strength training as well. Both factors are really important. They both work together. They'll complement each other, and you'll find as an esports athlete, but also just as a human, training both for your aerobic fitness, but also your strength will leave you much more well-rounded when you come to the end or throughout your training journey.
Oh, nice one. Thank you very much for all your answers today, guys. Tamashi, thanks for the raid. Sorry everybody who's just joined the channel here. We're just about wrapping up, but please do go check out the VOD. This has been an amazingly informative interview, and with Alex and Dan we've been talking about how esports athletes are affected by physical performance and how we can work on our physical performance to improve our esports performance. So yeah, thank you very, very much, guys, for joining me today. If you just want to give a shout out to your organizations or anybody else who you think's been really key in your development, then please do so now.
Yeah, if anyone wants to get in contact, they can connect with me on Twitter or Instagram. My handle's Daniel, Daniel, and my last name's Lavipour, Lavipour. So it's at Daniel Lavipour, Instagram and Twitter.
I'll post the links in the chat for you as well, Dan.
You can also find me at www.performanceready.co.uk.
There you go, but that's already linked for you there. Alex?
Yeah, so my Twitter's AJ_ePerformance. So yeah, if you have any questions or anything like that, please do just message me. I sometimes create a little bit of content on YouTube for that, so you can find all of that on Twitter. But yeah, hopefully you guys might be able to cheer for Barrage in the NLC this split, because I think this is an organization that I've stayed with for a long time, and there's a reason for it. So yeah, hopefully you guys can cheer for us coming into the NLC.
All right, nice one. I'll be looking forward to watching their progress. Everybody else, have a quick posture check, and thank you, guys. I'll catch up with you guys a bit later. Thank you very much for joining me. All right, so that was Dan and Alex from the various organizations. Thank you very much for joining me. Everybody in the chat, if you have any questions, please throw them in now. Just a quick reminder about the Rocket League Showdown tournament that we've got coming up on the May half term. It's the 25th to the 29th. Please make sure you're checking that out. And of course, It's not in this stream, but I will post the links in the chat in a moment. We are supporting the National Video Game Museum, which is undergoing a lot of stress at the moment through the whole lockdown period. So we are donating all of our Twitch revenue, any donations, any bits, subscriptions, all of that goes to them to help that great cause and keeping that great British Museum alive. Right, thank you ever so much. I've been Elliot, and I'll see you on, I think, Friday. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.